We're in Haftarah, Bhar. This is Jeremiah 32, verse 6 through 27. Do you remember the very first lesson? I confess that digging into the Haftarah was really new to me, and that I really hadn't spent a lot of time sort of getting to know the prophets. Well, in the process of doing these lessons for you, I'm getting a really, really deep appreciation for the prophets as individuals, right? And not just their messages. And I wonder if you're kind of getting the same appreciation. I'm learning that there's a lot of behind the scenes struggling that these heroes of the faith go through, right? We talked a little bit about that last week with Ezekiel, how he was training his whole life to be a priest and then switch. He's now a prophet, right? So these priests, they're really challenged as a person to carry out the things that God has asked them to. So what one of the things that's happened is I've pretty much stopped asking God to give me a grand assignment for him, because I know that I couldn't handle what challenges that he would use in my life to bring me up to that point, to be ready for that kind of assignment. Does that make sense? Even with people that that are doing, grand things for God, do you really understand the struggles that they've either gone through or currently going through, that are being used by God to prepare them to be the kind of vessels that he needs for what he requires of them? Like, I know I don't have a clue about those people in my life. And that was certainly the case for me with thinking about Jeremiah. Last week, again, started thinking about Ezekiel from that perspective. And so I'm hit with these things about Jeremiah this week. I really had no clue what Jeremiah was going through. So if you haven't read the Haftarah yet, please do that, because I'm just going to sort of summarize parts of it. Okay. So basically, God lets Jeremiah know ahead of time of this upcoming visit from Jeremiah's cousin, Hanamel. That he's going to be coming and asking Jeremiah to agree to purchase his land, Hanamel's land, that's in their ancestral town, under the terms of property redemption. And this week's Torah portion deals with property redemption. It deals with preserving the original family clan and those tribal borders that are within greater land of Israel. And the Torah portion this week spells out what those terms are, so that the family property doesn't pass into the hands of someone outside that tribe permanently. Okay. So, that to me begs the question, why? Why this land redemption? And it's really interesting if you haven't looked into it before. God says the land's his, right? He's the ultimate owner of the land. And that means that the ultimate power over the land rests with him as Israel's king. Okay? So God alone has the right to rule over and dispense lands of his kingdom how he sees fit. Now, this would have been how things were with kings in the ancient Near East. So it would not have been unusual for an ancient Near East king to have this ultimate right of land and give it to whom he wants. What would have been unusual is that one God, an unseen God, is the king, right? So God is the ultimate owner of the land of Israel. And he has given We can look at it like tenant possession. He's given tenant possession of the land to the people of Israel forever. Now, because the Israelites were only tenant administrators of God's land, that's why they were forbidden to sell the land, because they didn't own it. So then, okay, question is, what happens when, like in the case of mismanagement of this tenant property, or what happens in the case of dire circumstances where an Israelite becomes so poverty stricken that they're forced to sell their land portion? Because remember, he's only a tenant, it's God's land. So it turns out he doesn't actually sell ownership of the land. What he's able to do is sell the tenant possession or the administration of the land portion for a temporary period of time. So it was like the use of the land that he had was surrendered for a number of years. And money was exchanged, right? And then to keep the sale of the tenant possession from becoming permanent, God established the year of Jubilee, the 50th year, right? Which is the year following 7 sabbatical years, where in the case where land tenancy was sold to an outsider, someone outside that tribe, the land then reverted back to the original family heir. Whew. So Jeremiah was being asked to buy this tenant possession. And God tells him ahead of time to expect this visit from his cousin. And then, of course, the cousin shows up, sure enough, asking about this very thing. Well, that's a very cool story just in and of itself, right? But wait, because there's some background details to the story that actually turn this story on its head. Do you know where Jeremiah was when he gets this visit from his cousin? In prison. He was in prison for being a supposed traitor because of the prophecies that God had given him to the leadership of Judah. I mean, he can receive visitors, but it's also said that he receives a daily ration of bread as long as the supply holds out. Because remember, siege is going on. So think about all the uncertainties and fears and issues that would arise because of that. And then let's talk about that property that he's asked to redeem. It was in a town about 3 miles outside of Jerusalem. Wait a minute. The Babylonian armies are surrounding Jerusalem. So what's happened to the towns that are outside Jerusalem as the armies come into Jerusalem? Well, they're already enemy occupied. So Jeremiah is being offered to redeem land that was already under Babylonian control while he's in prison, while a siege is going on, knowing his prophecy that God's given him that Judah will go into captivity for 70 years. And Jeremiah goes through with the deal. He goes through with the land redemption from prison for a worthless piece of land that's enemy occupied. And astoundingly, Scripture records that Jeremiah is careful to follow every procedure to ensure the legality of this land transaction, including they would make 2 copies of the land deed that would then need to be signed in front of witnesses. So Jeremiah brings witnesses into where he is in prison. And after he signs them and puts the seal on them, Jeremiah gives them to his assistant and his scribe named Baruch. And he tells them to put them in a clay jar to keep them safe for the future. Think of the hope. Think of the promise that's in asking Jeremiah asking Baruch to take special care of these deeds to the land. Now, if you're familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, or you've seen pictures, or maybe you've seen the actual scrolls, well, the scrolls, but the clay jar that the scrolls were put in, it's those same kind of jars, and they were used specifically to keep something safe. Now, some wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So Baruch lived a long time. He lived to a ripe old age. And he was one of the ones who 70 years later were able to come back to Jerusalem. So remember, Cyrus, the Persian king, he made the decree that the exiled Jews could return to the land. This was 70 years later. Baruch was one of the ones who were able to return, and he returned with the deeds, and he was able to give the deeds to Jeremiah's heirs. So that's a really cool story. But think about what Jeremiah has been prophesying about this whole time. Okay, from Jeremiah chapter 16, he's been talking about this future day when the nations of the world, the Gentiles, right? The nations will come to the kingdom of Judah in the future. These very ones that are going to be exiled, right? That the nations will come to Judah and exchange their false gods and their idols for intimately knowing and being known by the God of Israel. Now, next week's Haftarah, we actually get to cover Jeremiah chapter 16, where the Gentiles, that they'll come, it says, Gentiles will come to you, Judah, from the ends of the earth and say, surely our fathers have inherited lies. So we get to talk about that next week. But that's all part of the prophecy that Jeremiah has been proclaiming to the people, right? And tied into that promise that the nations will come and exchange their idols for intimacy with God, they'll do it through Judah. Tied to that prophecy is this promise that Judah, who's about to be carried into captivity, that they will be restored back to their land to take their rightful position, get this, to take their rightful position of being the ones that the nations come to learn about God and draw close to God. Now, you and I listening to a prophet, we don't just want to have the prophet tell us what we need to do, right, to obey the voice of God. We need our prophet to demonstrate that they have their own, his or her own faithfulness. Because just as it is with anything, we learn faith best by having it modeled to us, right? So, of course, God is going to ask Jeremiah to do this land deal, because this is a concrete example of, Jeremiah, do you really trust what I've been saying to you? Do you really trust that, you're in prison, we're under siege, this land property that you're asked to redeem is under Babylonian control. Do you really believe when I say all will be restored? And so Jeremiah does, and he puts his money where his mouth is, as they say. Of course, he's going to agree to redeem this ancestral land, because he believes. Believe is an action, not just a feeling. He believes that Judah will be restored back to the land. If he's preaching Shema Israel, he needs to do the same, right? So he used his own money to deliver this message that was even stronger than the words that he could say. He delivered God's message by his own actions, that even in Judah's going into exile, it was assured and it was trusted that they will return. God will fulfill the full restoration of Judah to the land, and the people of the nations would come to God through Judah. Let's pause and remember that our Messiah is this King of Judah, and it's he who gathers the exiles and brings in the nations. And there's so much more to this idea of the end of the exile than what we can cover here. The last thing that I want to mention that was really awesome about this Haftarah, the sages, they've brought out how lovely it is that Jeremiah obeyed, not just verbally, but with his actual actions. He actually did that legal land transaction. And he did it before he asked God why. And the sages say that this is a wonderful way to approach prayer. We can use him as a model. Questions are good. They're encouraged after you fulfill the will of God. Those questions are good in that order, right? Questions that come before you fulfill the will of God, maybe not so good. And I love this because questions to God done Jeremiah's way, that builds relationship with God. But not just, but because you fulfill his will first and then ask the questions, in that relationship with God, it also preserves his honor and his sovereignty and his greatness. Because he's not our buddy, he's our king. So we obey him first, right? And when you think about it, Yeshua followed this pattern too. He did ask the cup of his suffering pass, but he was quick to say, not my will, but yours, Father. But he never asked why before he obeyed. And that's the kind of trust that Jeremiah modeled. That's the kind of trust Yeshua modeled. That's the kind of trust that you and I can set our sights on to work up to, because we have these models for how it would be. So that's what I got for this lesson, and see you next week.